kingdom of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, now and ever, and forever.
I will begin with a reading from Isaiah, which is actually, Isaiah does inspire a lot of the hymns of the fasting seasons. And so I think it is very appropriate to look to him as the church does also. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Is not this the fast that I chose? To loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and bring the homeless poor into your home? When you see the naked, to cover him, and not to hide yourself from your own flesh? Then shall your light break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up speedily. Your righteousness shall go before you. The glory of the Lord shall be your rear guard. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Isaiah really does describe very aptly and beautifully the process which we refer to as ascesis, where we get the word asceticism from. And asceticism is really a foundational experience of Christianity. It literally means exercise or training or practice. And so the word is rooted in the experience of perfection or seeking perfection in the Christian life. And the means to get to that perfection is through asceticism, ascesis. So that, and we'll return back to that a little bit more as we go and hear it echoed. But for now, we're going to start by looking at monasticism. Monasticism seems to be very firmly rooted in this season. We venerate a number of important monastics because, of course, they are the ones who we could say live the Lenten journey with a very specific intensity that has to do, of course, with their monastic lifestyle, which seems to be a lifestyle that is like a lifelong Lent, you could almost say. But that is the perception that we kind of have from the outside. And monasticism has a little bit of a, I would say, a little different history. So starting at the very beginning of monasticism, it's based on the call by Christ, the call to be set apart, to be somehow different from the rest. And the early church showed that through a very specific code of conduct and the lifestyle, a very ethically based lifestyle guided by the Gospels. Those who were the most emblematic and iconic figures of that Christian life and perfection are the martyrs, because they were the ones, and this starting from the very early church, from St. Stephen, the first martyr, and then through the apostles, through Peter and Paul, who were all martyrs. So there was no real question about their conviction when it comes to the message of Christ and the gospel, because they were willing to give their life and lose their life for the gospel. But we begin to hear in the 3rd century, so in the beginning of the 3rd century, so around starting at around the year 200, we begin to see a call within the Christian community for a greater austerity in life. And the first reference which we find to something that we could say is kind of monastic, or might be the origins, or like the first generation of monastic type people, we find in the Apology of Saint Justin the Martyr. And he writes specifically that there was a need for a more austere and stark Christian lifestyle, and that some among them, among the group of Christians, some had been practicing chastity, celibacy, poverty, prayer, and fasting. And so the fact that he mentioned it, it means that it was not of the same common type that was lived by most Christians, but this was a little more radical, we would say. Some, people who had perhaps a deeper conviction and were willing to leave behind certain parts of what would be considered normal life, so that they could be more perfect in following Christ. And so we begin to hear this distinction between the good Christians, normal Christians, and those who have made a commitment to a different type of life. And by the mid-3rd century, so we're talking about 250 and after, we begin to hear about Christians who flee the world, and they leave the world, the city life, and go to the desert. And in the desert, they live alone or in small groups. And what they're doing is actually they are basing their experience on something that we find in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22, verse 30. Jesus said to them in reply, "You are misled because you do not know the scriptures or the power of God. At the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like the angels in heaven." And so this concept of the angelic life becomes the guiding factor for what would eventually be known as monasticism. These groups of people, so this is, just to get it straight, our concept of desert living is not Sedona, Arizona, okay? This is desert living, as in barely living, going into the desert and not being sure if you will survive. So this was a very harsh reality. It was a very difficult life to choose. And so we begin to hear some of these words which become associated with monasticism. We hear anchorites. Anchorites the word anchorite comes from anachoresis, and it literally means to flee. It is you could translate it literally as anti-city. Choros is town. And so those who would later be called monastics, they start by being called anchorites. It has nothing to do with an anchor. It's all about this process of fleeing or departing the life that was convenient and common, the life in communities and villages. Remember also life in general was more of a community reality, because people who would live isolated would easily be targeted by thieves and robbers, and so there was safety when people lived in villages or in proximity to each other. So family groups would live in, even if they had a ranch, you would have extended family living in more of a group setting. And so this was the antithesis of normal life, to go away, to depart. The next word that we find at this time that becomes common is the word hermit. And hermit literally means, it comes from the Greek word eremos, which means desert. So hermit would be, literal translation would be desert liver, desert dweller. And then begins some of the more familiar terminology. Monastic or monk comes from the Greek word monos, which means alone. So the primary purpose of monasticism was to live the Christian life seeking perfection and to die to the world. At the end of the 3rd century, Christianity is becoming much more settled throughout the Mediterranean world, throughout the Roman Empire, and martyrdom is not as common, meaning that Christians in some places are already being permitted to gather publicly or to live publicly as Christians. And so this reality meant that the heroes of the faith, the martyrs, who were the point of reference for Christians, were not as much a reality. And of course, that changes when we come into the 4th century, and Constantine in the year 313 legalizes Christianity with the Edict of Milan. And one of the things that happens is that thousands of people flee the city life and they go into the deserts. And not only in Egypt, it seems that the phenomenon of monasticism, of this anchorite life, begins in the Egyptian desert. But wherever there were deserts in the Middle East, monasticism happened. And probably the influence of Egypt was also felt. So one of the first monastics that I'd like to look at a little bit is Saint Anthony of Egypt. Saint Anthony of Egypt, also called Saint Anthony the Great, decided to leave his comfortable Egyptian family life around the year 285 as a teenager. And he left for the desert of Middle Egypt. he became quite famous, and many people followed him, many other monks or would-be monks. And so he created a system of life. He's given, even though he is the recipient of a tradition, he was fleeing to the desert as many others were, because of the fact that he had people who followed him, people who wanted his spiritual guidance, who wanted to live in proximity to him. He decided he needed to devise some sort of an organized life for a community of sorts. And so he devised this structure, which in Greek is called a lavra. And lavra means village. It's a small town, village. And it was in a sense, it was a compromise, because the words that most aptly describe Saint Anthony's desire are his own words: living alone with God, only him as my companion. And so he was still striving for this monos, this monasticism that was alone. And so what he did with this lavra, this monastic village, was that each person, and men and women, lived separately, so not in close proximity of each other. And each person had a hut or a small house, a dwelling or a cave. And they shared in a couple of common activities, such as prayer, worship, liturgy in a church type of structure, a chapel, you could say, as well as some common tasks, common meals. And so you can already see that there are the beginnings of community, even though the insistence by St. Anthony is on solitude, on everyone still being alone. And so there wasn't any of the structure that we know of in monasteries with, superiors and elections and things like that. The monk, Anthony, like other monks who were at the same time living in other deserts, and so there is the desert of Judea, there is the desert of the Egyptian Sinai, what is today Egypt, but the Sinai Peninsula. There is the Syrian desert. So there were a number of deserts that had monasticism already beginning in these places. And the model was still, though, of following a spiritual elder. So following a spiritual father. So it was not so much about the structure of a monastic building. And however, that does change quite quickly. Saint Pachomius of Egypt, who died in the year 346, so he begins what is called the Cenobitic form of monasticism. Cenobitic, which is again one of those technical terms, it is a composite word from Greek made of two words, kinos vios, which means the community life, the common life. And so this structure becomes, it builds on St. Anthony's original idea of lavra, of monastic village. But so it takes things such as the huts or dwellings, common prayer, common liturgy, but then it also adds on common clothes. So they're wearing clothes that is similar to each other. They cover their heads, and they wear a linen scarf around their neck. And so we're already seeing what sounds like monasticism in its familiar form. So what is then still unusual about this? It is that at this time, so mid 4th century, Christianity is thriving. Monastics are in the desert, men and women, monasteries, communities that are villages, thousands and thousands of people are going into the desert to die to this world so that they may live fully and attain Christian perfection. The unusual thing is that monastics were lay people. So although there were priests and spiritual fathers and leaders, monastics were primarily lay people, laity seeking Christian perfection. There was no ceremony, there were no vows, and those who were monastics also did not seek any ordination or any rank in the church. The monastics of the 4th century, if we want to make a comparison with some of the phenomena in our time and in Christianity, the monastics of the 4th century would be like the charismatics today. They would be the zealous element of Christianity. They would be the ones who are living outside of the traditional structures and the familiar structures. And since they, even though we give credit to St. Anthony for having given a certain arrangement to monastic life, and then St. Pachomius for further developing community life, the reality is that it was still very, very loose and very much guided by the personality and spirituality of the spiritual father who was the leader of the community. And so that brings me now to the dark side of that. What happens when you have, a structure or a group of people that are not under a bishop technically, kind of doing their own thing? Some have good guidance and some have not so good guidance. And so we find then that a spiritual father who, by all intents and purposes, didn't start off all that bad, a man named Eustathios of Sebastia, he comes from Egypt and goes to Asia Minor. So Asia Minor is where Cappadocia is. It is where St. Nicholas is from. It is where St. Basil is from. It is a part today in Turkey, but it is an area that is very rich in Christian history, in martyrs, in St. Helena is from there also. So there are a number of very, very important people in the church who come from that area. And it's also not far from the city of Constantinople. But at that time in the 4th century, it still really didn't have much in the ways of monastic life. And so Eustathios brings monasticism to Asia Minor, and his community began to teach that marriage makes one unsuitable for salvation, and likewise, the consumption of meat is also something that is evil when it comes to the seeking Christian perfection. So that's something that would not fly here in Texas. Obviously, this was an extreme, and the local synod of the town of Gangra, which was the monastic community, was in the region where Gangra is. So there the bishops gathered local bishops, and they condemned this teaching, and they condemned the community. However, there were also other excesses, and one of them is the heresy of Messalianism. Messalianism comes from the monastic setting, monasteries that you would say communities, villages, monastic villages that have poverty, celibacy, and fasting and prayer at their core, and yet they deny the necessity of a sacramental life. And so no sacraments, no worship, no liturgy. And so they were kind of almost a group that wanted to remain lay-led without any relationship with the local church and the local priests. Messalianism was such a big problem within the church that it was condemned, and those who preached it were excommunicated at the Council of Ephesus in the year 431. So those two are examples of excesses that would be considered negative. Now, there are excesses that are considered positive. That sounds like a real conundrum, and it is, because there are two primary examples of this positive excess, and one of them in monasticism is the non-sleeper movement. And St. John Chrysostom was also influenced by this movement. And these were monastics who, they did everything so that they could dominate their physical reality. You know, it's mind over matter, and not sleep. And they would literally, of course, they would have no bed or any place to lay down in their cell. And they would have ropes hanging from the ceiling so that they could sustain themselves. And so they chose sleep deprivation as a means of ascesis, of spiritual exercise. And this movement gained quite a bit of traction. And now as far as the, weirdness factor, yes, it's definitely out there. And while there may still be monastics who do some form of this, it is definitely on the more unusual end of things. And comparably, I know many of you are probably familiar with like some of the medieval practices in Roman Catholic monasteries, where forms of ascesis included the inflicting of physical pain. where, a nun or a monk may self-flagellate, and that kind of stuff is found throughout the world, throughout the monastic world. It has that connotation of suffering and controlling that suffering so that one could focus their physical reality and, of course, perfect their mind's control over their physicality as a way of perfection for the kingdom. So it has, how healthy it is, that's another question. How psychologically it may affect, people can analyze it, and they do, but there is the underlying reality is this of willingly accepting suffering for a greater good. And we'll see some of that in some of the examples we'll also look at. Now, another form of monasticism from the same period. So we're talking about the end of the 4th century and the 5th century are the Stylites. And the Stylites, stylos in Greek is column or pillar. They are a group of monastics who have chosen to live kind of in plain sight, so removed from the people that follow them. There are disciples and spiritual children, but they live on a pillar for years. And this was the most famous one, who we'll look at a little later, is Saint Simeon the Stylite. And he set up an example that then influenced other Stylites. And there were Stylites, believe it or not, even as far as France. So his influence went well beyond his native Syria to North Africa and even Western Europe, because his lifestyle was very unusual. And then from that, we also have a couple of other types of monasticism, or you could say it's an ascetic practice. So monasticism is either in the form of hermit, so living isolated and alone, or the cenobitic, the community life. So those are the two forms of monasticism. Then the Stylite and the other forms of that, those are forms of ascesis. And some of the specific forms that come in this period, so we got the Stylite, but we also have dendrites. And dendrites were tree dwellers. So they were monastics who, instead of going on the top of a column or a pillar, they lived for a period of time in a tree. And it's nothing romantic, like it's not a tree house. It's nothing like that. It's purely living on the branches in a tree, experiencing the weather fully, and without any shelter, and being dependent on the kindness of other monastics to help them out. Again, it's a choice for suffering. Another form of asceticism, which falls within this monastic ideal, are the Fools for Christ. The Fools for Christ are a later group, starting about 100 years later. So in the in the 7th century, late 6th century, we start to see this phenomenon of people who make a choice to live usually homeless, and being completely dejected and rejected by society, and even abused, called all different kinds of names, considered to be emotionally or mentally impaired. And they accept all of that, again, as a form of ascesis, of spiritual exercise for perfection. Now, how do we know about them? Well, they usually had a disciple or some spiritual child who was aware of it. And in some cases, the spiritual child would become a priest or a bishop. And so their story was then preserved and it was told. But in their life, very often they were not recognized. The fools for Christ are still there. There are some who live that way, especially in Eastern Europe. There are a number of rather recent saints in Russia, as well as one just a few years ago who passed away in Bulgaria, who lived his life also basically on the street, receiving all different kinds of abuse. And now after he died, so many people came forward and spoke of the things that he had done and how he helped people and saved them and gave out money. And I mean, it's really a very unusual form of ascesis, of asceticism. So those are some of the forms that ascetical life can take. Now, monasticism, though, still has a little bit more development to make. Saint Basil the Great, who was a bishop in Asia Minor, in Cappadocia, he was also influenced by Eustathios being the founder of the heretical monastics who didn't like married life and were vegan. He took what they had established, and the monastery of Eustathius, that community had been disbanded because they were condemned by the local synod of bishops. But Basil took what he recognized as being good qualities, and he decided to structure it. And he also added to those who would come to the monastery, whether, monastery, more of the monastery village, he added to it tonsure, as well as a religious service that included the making of vows. And then he also was a little more strict about the dress code and the wearing of a specific habit. He also, in his jurisdiction, in his archdiocese, he recognized that monastics, monastic men and women, were not lay people, but they were a separate status. So they weren't clerics, they weren't clergy, but they also weren't laity. And he compiled two books, one that is called The Great Rules, and it is the foundation of monastic life and structure. And then he also wrote another book called The Brief Rule, which is just a smaller version of The Great Rule. He taught, and this is why monasticism is so important within the church and within the Christian tradition, and especially in this time of Lent. The monastic life, the shared common life, is the ideal Christian life. And so he made no distinction in monasticism being removed from what the laity live. He saw the persons, he gave them a certain status, but the life of the Christian is monastic. We're called to many of these same ideals. So from his rule, we get a certain number of ideals or characteristics of monastic life. The goal of monastic life, this is according to St. Basil, the goal of monastic life is Christian perfection. Together, monastics practice all Christian virtues, especially love. Monastics practice obedience to a spiritual father or a spiritual mother. Monastics practice chastity, poverty, and the sharing of all goods. When a monastic would be considered perfect, so a better term is probably mature. So a young man or woman who has already dedicated a part of their life to living in the monastic community, and they are well committed and disposed to that life, they would be permitted to work in the world. And so they would work specifically at jobs that require supervision of the church, but also have a social outreach component. And so Basil, in his own archdiocese, Basil erected schools and orphanages and hospitals. And so these were staffed very often by the monastics. And so it was not that they were completely removed from society, but rather that the interaction between monastic men and women, the interaction between them and lay people would assist and support and instruct lay persons in the pursuit of Christian virtues and Christian perfection. So he saw natural ebb and flow between monasticism and lay people. So it was not a removed reality, but rather it was something that was a necessary part of the life of the church. And later, fathers would refer to monasticism as the heart of any diocese. Now, the other part of Basil's, at least Basil's structuring of monasticism was that he insisted that monasteries be under the local bishop. And so as such, there was never a real option for a monastery to become, an international congregation or organization that stretched, around the world. Everything was tied to the local church. And very often the monasteries would also, and this was after Basil, the monasteries would be places where young men could go to study theology, prepare themselves to be ordained. Very often bishops were chosen from the monks who were there, the spiritual fathers. And so there was a natural connectedness, and it wasn't the church of the laity and then the monastics over there on the mountain. So this is all happening before the year 450. All of this is rolling. And monasticism is booming because it presents to Christians who are zealous and committed to their faith, it presents them an opportunity of spiritual martyrdom, of dying to this world so that one could attain a greater good, could live more fully and attain perfection. Monasteries, though, although they were occurring at this point in the East, they also did at this time spread to the West. Saint Athanasius of Alexandria wrote the book, The Life of Saint Anthony of Egypt. And that was written in Greek and Coptic, and then translated into Latin. And so it was already in the early 5th century, it was already spreading to places in the West. Saint Jerome, who is famous for his translation of the Bible into Latin, Saint Jerome was actually a monk in the Holy Land. So he was influenced by the experience of the desert monastics who were living in Judea. And he and his fellow Westerner, European monk, Rufinus, brought the life of Saint Anthony to the West and helped diffuse that text so that we can find already monasticism appearing in small forms in Milan through the sponsorship of Saint Ambrose, who died in the year 395. And so in Milan, there is already a monastery. And Saint Augustine, who founded multiple monastic communities in North Africa, and he died in the year 430. Saint Martin of Tours also founded monasteries in France already in the year 370. And finally, Saint John Cashion, who was a Western Christian, he returned to Gaul, which was Roman France, and founded a number of monasteries in the year around the year 415. St. John Cashion is important because he is one of the early Western fathers and authors, and also because he was ordained a deacon by St. John Chrysostom in Constantinople. And when Chrysostom was exiled, so John Cashion decided to abandon Constantinople and return back to his native Gaul. So monasticism is at this point already in the 5th century, spreading throughout the West. And the vows of monastics are based on Saint Basil's rule, are to stay in the monastery community until their last breath, preserve chastity, virginity, and reverence, obey their superiors and their brotherhood or sisterhood, live in non-possession and voluntary poverty in a common community life for Christ. Accept rules of monastic life and the rules of the Holy Fathers and the rules of the superiors, the abbot, and ultimately endure every inconvenience and sorrow for the kingdom. So monastic structure is becoming, at this point, very well organized. Asceticism, which, while not all Christians, obviously at this point, are called to monasticism, the expression of monasticism is asceticism. And so the ascetic practice, this spiritual exercise, self-discipline, training, is a common tool for both monastic and lay Christian alike. And the understanding is that the sacrifices one makes in the ascetic journey, in this training and exercise, these sacrifices are made for the sake of eternal life. The purpose of this spiritual exercise is to fortify our nature against spiritual termites that seek to gnaw through our resolution. Asceticism redirects our energies towards virtues, and asceticism presupposes the strengthening and restoration of nature by God's plan. And the restoration of nature, of course, we're talking about the resurrection, and what we refer to the fruit of this struggle for Christian perfection is theosis. Ascesis, if you want to, all of these practices, they come with a very fundamental guidance from the New Testament. And so the practice of ascesis, we can find a clear reference to it in the letter to the Romans. For if you live according to the flesh, you die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. So that's very aptly, it conveys exactly what is the goal of ascesis. And then the concept of, so what is what is Christian perfection? Christian perfection is theosis. It is deification. And that we get from, among other texts, but it very clearly worded from the second letter of Peter, chapter 1. His divine power has bestowed on us everything that makes for life and devotion through the knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and power. Through these, he has bestowed on us the precious and very great promises, so that through them you may come to share in the divine nature, after escaping from the corruption that is in the world because of evil desire. Very important there. You may come to share in the divine nature. That is deification. It means, the fathers express it. They said that, well, why did Jesus become one of us? He became one of us. He became a human being, took on our humanity, so that through him we might become divine. So it's not in the sense of becoming God. That was problem number one in the garden, Adam and Eve wanting to be God. But we share in divinity. We share in that nature because each one of us has image and likeness of God within. So we are bearers of that reality. And so there is, I found a very interesting quote. It's nice to be able to quote the different fathers and everything throughout the centuries, but I found an interview with a monastic, a monk on Mount Athos. Mount Athos is in Greece, and it is a monastic republic. It is a peninsula that has monasteries dotting the peninsula overlooking the Mediterranean. And they hold many relics and treasures. There's over 1,000 years of monasteries there. And a question was asked of a monk from Australia who was living on Mount Athos, and they interviewed him and they said, why did you come here all the way from Australia? Why did you come to Athos? And he responded, I came here to die so that when I die, I won't die. It is, and it's very interesting because, of course, that echoes exactly what the early church saw in monasticism. It was the new martyrdom. And so by dying, one lives. And so it's a very, I think, a beautiful way of expressing, in a very simple way, expressing the challenges that there are when we talk about monasticism. Now, there is also, I would like to touch on a couple of other practices when it comes to the monastic life. And this is why we look to certain monastics at this time during Lent for spiritual examples, and we read their writings. One of the monastics that we read is St. John of the Ladder, and his writing is at best it's very dense and difficult. He's not an easy read, and so one of the reasons why he is read during Lent in the way that he is read in pieces, parts. So it's a gradual reading instead of just reading it like a book, because it is a collection of wise advice from a spiritual father. And St. John of the Ladder, so just as a little bit of information about him. So he was born in the year 579 in Palestine, and found his way to Mount Sinai. And on Mount Sinai had just been established recently the Monastery of St. Catherine. It was established and built by Justinian, who also built Hagia Sophia Cathedral in Constantinople. John, as a child, felt a strong desire to enter a community. And so at the age of 16, he entered the monastery of St. Catherine on Sinai. And there he lived a life that we don't know much about. There is not too much information about him other than his own words. What we do know is that he spent weeks and months at a time in prayer on Mount Sinai. The monastery is at the foot of Mount Sinai, And so he would climb Mount Sinai, and his prayer on the mountain is what helped him produce some of these texts. And the monastics, the other monks who were around him, were edified by his example, and they asked him to write his advice for this process. And so the advice is in the construct of climbing a ladder. And so it is on this, at each rung, there are certain challenges that we must face and desires that we must overcome. And so that is, in a sense, it is his guide for attaining spiritual perfection. And his book, The Ladder of Divine Ascent, which is available in English, which you can find online. At the end, I'll share with you some books that I have so that you can look this up. It is considered a Lenten text and read in many homes around the world during this season. As I said, it's not an easy text. It is not a feel-good text. It has many very accusing words, and so it will be, and it is a challenge to read, but it is the foundational book of the monastic life, and beyond the monastic life, the spiritual life. So John of the Ladder is one of those monastics who is very important. He comes out of a tradition, though. This is I had mentioned this on Sunday in the homily. He comes out of a tradition that formed in the very early church. Again, this is a form of asceticism, one of the exercises of the spiritual life. And it is called hesychasm. Hesychasm comes from the Greek word ησυχία, which means silence or stillness. And it is, we find this word already being used within monastic settings from the 5th century. So although it had not been completely described or worked out theologically until some 700 years later, it is this reality. It is the mystical tradition of contemplative prayer. It is the process of looking inward to experience God. And the experience of God, it can lead to a vision of the light of God, the uncreated light. Now, we're not going to get into all of that because that's a little dense. But the process of hesychasm has 3 steps. And the first step is catharsis. It is the watchfulness and purification and emptying of oneself. The second step in this process is theoria, or illumination. It is now the filling in with godliness. And that can be done specifically through the cultivation of virtues, the cultivation of a prayer life, an intense prayer life, and of course, fasting as well as other practices. And then the third step in this process is deification. It is theosis, the contemplation of the uncreated light of God, the acquisition of the Holy Spirit. So, and this is what I'm giving you, this description, these 3 steps actually are from a little bit later. We're already looking at the 12th century when it becomes formulated in this way, because the earlier monastics, so they were not so concerned about necessarily writing down categories of spirituality and spiritual life. Today spirituality is something that you can go and sign up at a Catholic university and study it. And, that would probably make many of the monastic fathers laugh, because their concern was not about studying spirituality, it was about doing spirituality. So there's a little bit of a disconnect when it comes to the exercise of these means of ascetic living. Now, so one of the monastics that I would like to look at just a little bit is Saint Simeon the Stylite. And the Stylites are, there aren't that many of them. Of course, there could be many. We don't know, because the whole point of monasticism was to not be known by the world. So we're in a couple of weeks, we're going to look at the life of Saint Mary of Egypt. And, this is a woman who lived in the desert for over 40 years. And the last year of her life, a priest happened to encounter her in the desert. But she could have lived and died in the desert and nobody would have known about her. And for those who are living that ascetical life or that monastic life, that's exactly what they want. They don't want to be recognized as saints, because all that is important to them is being with God. And so they don't mind, they're not bothered that somebody might, not know they're there. And so in a similar way, Simeon, so he's known to us, but his life is very interesting, because there are books, the lives of Simeon Stylite, because there are a number of different authors who have written from their own experiences of him, and some of them actually met him. So it is fascinating to consider that. So he was born around the year 390 to a poor Syrian shepherd family. And which part of Syria? It is the part of Syria that ISIS messed up, right under Turkey, where there were many, many people who died, many Kurds who died. So that region, which we heard about in recent years, that is where Simeon was born. Early in life, he felt a strong call by God to live the monastic life. And so he lived in 2 monasteries that we know of. And you might say, well, what about monastic stability? Isn't the monk supposed to go to one monastery and stay there until his last breath, as Saint Basil had instructed? Well, Simeon had a couple of bad experiences, let's put it that way. In both monasteries, he had committed himself to a very rigorous ascetical life. And in one of the lives that we read about his story, in one of the monasteries, he had decided to fast from food for all 40 days of Lent, eat absolutely nothing. Well, the monks, his fellow monks, became kind of critical of his practices, and they thought that he was just showing off, and that plus it made them look bad because none of them wanted to fast from food all of Lent. And so from one of the monasteries, they asked him to leave. And so he did, and went to another monastery where he had a similar experience, where again, the monastics who were there saw his monastic ascetical life, the sacrifices he was making, as just way over the top, way too much for them. And so Simeon then decides to become a wandering hermit. And so he wanders alone through the desert and from village to village, and dependent on the kindness and generosity of strangers. And what happens? Well, his holiness is recognized, and people come and talk to him, and they ask for his guidance. And all of a sudden he finds that he is no longer really a hermit, but he's traveling in the company of people who are now following him. And some of them are his disciples and spiritual children. Others are just pious people who want to be in his presence and to listen to his wisdom, and also see the miracles that he was performing. So Simeon, in no uncertain terms, becomes annoyed by the constant presence of people around him. And even though he tries to tell them that, he was trying to preserve silence as he travels, inevitably people keep on asking him questions. And so as they travel, he finds an old Roman column standing there with other ruins. And so he climbs to the top of it. It was 16 feet tall. And so he climbed to the top of it, and he stayed there for a number of days, as everybody at the foot of the pillar were all yelling at him and trying to get him to come down. And he realized there that there he could find silence, even though he could still hear the annoying people below. But he found a peace on top of that column that was what his heart desired. And so then he went from that column, and he found a bigger column, a taller column. And then finally, he found a column that was even bigger, that was the one that he lived on for over 30 years. And this final column was about, according to the lives, was about 60 feet high, and about 6 feet in circumference. So it was a little bigger, but it was not, don't think that this was a column that had a little house at the top or anything like that. It was very basic. He lived exposed to the elements on top, and according to his lives, the ones that we read, so he was, even overnight, he would be tied down to the column. He would tie himself so that in his sleep he would not fall off the column. So that's a little bit of anxiety. It's not just about falling out of bed. And some of the expressions that he used, his goal in living atop a column, which, was very extreme, was very different. No one had ever done this. Jesus never did anything like this. I'm sure he heard a constant litany of people who were telling him that this was just plain weird and this was not biblical, and there's nothing like this. But his goal, in his own words, was to spiritually, through this exercise, this ascesis, to spiritually fly to heaven by subduing all desires through fasting, prayer, and contemplation. So, and the pillar, the irony, of course, and this is, God does a lot with irony. The choice of the pillar was, yes, it was to remove himself from the disciples that had kind of accumulated around him, and the other, people who had also committed to a monastic life because of him. But, he wanted to be a hermit. He wanted to be alone. And so the pillar was not something he did for show. He did it because it was a way of attaining solitude, of being alone, only with God. And he likened the pillar, the being in between heaven and earth, he likened that to Christ being suspended on the cross between heaven and earth. And so he saw this reality for himself. And like I said, the irony of this is that when he got on that final huge pillar, it attracted people like crazy. So all of his, his choice for living alone only made him more famous. More people wrote about him. When you read the lives of Simeon, so you realize that, incredible ascetical life, monasticism, this is only a saint could endure on top of a pillar, snow, heat, rain, the sun, the cold of the night, all exposed. And, no contact with people. One does kind of get a sense that he may not have been necessarily a people person. And so, his column was a way of turning some antisocial behavior into, sanctification for the kingdom. So not a bad thing. And so when you read in the life, there are some words that the authors are very careful because they don't want to necessarily write badly about him. And so you'll notice when they talk about his interaction with people. So in the English translation, they say, occasionally he conversed with people. So apparently he had to be kind of forced, and I would say probably just the amount of people there would cause that. But he had conversations with pilgrims, with people who came to visit him for spiritual guidance, with his spiritual children. And in the life, he also preached to pagans, and through his preaching caused their conversion. Now, granted, all this happened from atop the column. So he stayed there and preached down to them. He also was criticized. There were other monks who came to visit him and accused him of doing all of this just because he wanted attention and he wanted people to recognize him as being really, really holy. And these monks who made the accusation, so he invited them to come to the top of the pillar. And so they started, they put the ladder up to help them climb up. Neither of them made it to the top. They freaked out, and they said it was just way too high. And so they recanted their accusations against him. And there is even the story of the Roman emperor, Roman being the Byzantine emperor, Leo I, consulting with Simeon for advice on Christology. And because at that time we're dealing with the Council of Chalcedon and Ephesus, which happened in that century. And when he died, so news of his death spread throughout the Christian world. By the time he died, he was well known even in the West, especially in monasteries. Simeon's life shows that suffering is the means of union with Christ. Think about it. He essentially, in his life, he did nothing. He didn't work. He didn't get paid a salary. He had no family. He didn't get married, didn't have children. He didn't build a church or a monastery. He had no savings. And yet he stood in rain and heat and snow on top of a column, and he pushed his body way past its physical limitations. He showed in his life that suffering, assuming also that suffering, he chose that, is a means for transformation. And so through that suffering, he unites himself to Christ. There is one of the stories, and there are many stories in the lives of Simeon the Stylite. One of the stories that is told is about a local Arab ruler who comes to Simeon and asks Simeon to pray for him. And this ruler is there with his people, and all dressed very lavishly, and he's standing at the foot of this column looking up at Simeon. And Simeon is at this point has already been on the column for almost 30 years. And around his waist, he has a rope tied, and the rope has been slowly cutting into his flesh. And so he has a wound around his waist from that rope. And of course, also he has maggots that are between the rope and his flesh. One of these maggots falls from Simeon's waist, and it falls down by the shoe of the Arab prince. And immediately the people who are there with him, so they're grossed out. They're all just like, this is disgusting. Let's get out of here. But the Arab prince, he leans over and he picks up the maggot and puts it in his hand, and in his hand it becomes a pearl. And so it becomes that's one of those images that talks about the transformative power of suffering. That suffering can become something of great value. And just to kind of, Simeon's influence also goes very far and wide. In the Roman Catholic Church, Saint Francis de Sales wrote about Simeon the Stylite. And this is kind of the general, I would say, opinion when it comes to the West and dealing, how do you deal with Simeon? And he said, in Simeon, there is more for us to marvel at than to imitate. So it's kind of funny how his take on it is. And in a sense, it's a recognition, but it's also kind of the understanding that this is really quite difficult. And I think indeed, with all of the martyrs of the early church, there is a lot to marvel at, and it's a little bit more difficult to imitate. What is the gist of these different monastics? Well, it's about ascesis. It's about the ascetic journey, choosing to look at suffering and difficulty and problems, not just of our own making, but also the things we deal with, and see it as a means of sanctification, as part of a process that will transform, that will make us closer to Christ, that will conform us to the will of God, and eventually make us perfect in the Christian faith. So, the monastics are, for that reason, very important. I do have a couple of images that I would like to share with you. This here is actually an icon from the monastery of St. Catherine in Sinai, an icon from the 12th century, an image of the ladder of divine ascent. And you can see the monastics. He wrote it for a monastic setting, so that is why you don't see lay persons on the ladder. You see monks, and the monks are being tempted and pulled down by little demons, and then swallowed up at the bottom by the mouth of hell. So it's a way of expressing that guidance from his book. Then this here is a photograph of the ruins of the column of Saint Simeon the Stylite. When he died, a church was built around the column. So what we see there in the foreground is the base, and then what is left of the column. The church, unfortunately, was partially destroyed with the arrival of Islam. It is today in Syria. Unfortunately, even more damage has happened to it under ISIS, that were occupying that whole area for a number of years. But it is still standing, it is still there. And that church is enormous. At one time, that was one of the largest churches in the Middle East. And then Saint Simeon was visited. It was a place of pilgrimage from almost immediately after his death. While many Christians went to him when he was still alive, it became a destination. Christians who were traveling from other parts of the Roman Empire very often made their way to the column of St. Simeon, and then continue their travels over to specifically to the Holy Land. And so this here is we would call this a souvenir trinket, probably the cover of a box that may have held in it at one time maybe a rock, a part of the column. As you can tell, the column is no longer 60 feet high. And I think many Christians through the centuries have chipped away at that column and taken souvenirs as it's a relic of Saint Simeon. This one here, which shows at the bottom there is one of his disciples, and then the angels, and that's kind of, we could say, a more traditional icon of Saint Simeon. But Simeon was very popular in Victorian England, of all places, and there are many images of him done by artists. And the images are, I would say, surprisingly more consistent with the ravages of one living atop a column for over 30 years, and quite, I would say, even more expressive than some of the icons, which really is interesting. See, here's another one done as a line drawing, then one more done as a painting. The other category of saints, we talked about the dendrites, those who lived in trees. Dendrite would be this. This is Saint David of Thessaloniki, who lived in a tree. Now, he did not live in a tree for like 30 years. He lived in a tree for 3 years, and then was called by God to live in a monastic cell in silence. And so his life is another interesting ascetic life that again has a challenge. There is a beautiful icon, I think it's a fresco from one of the churches that shows, it's an image of the monastic life, of the monastic fathers and even some mothers. And these are specific saints. You've got Jesus, who is carrying his cross, and then right behind him is Saint Anthony of Egypt. And then there are Saint Saba, Saint Ephemios, and other saints who, and this is the embracing of suffering, carrying one's cross, so to speak, but embracing suffering because of its transformative power, and primarily because it's an idea of uniting oneself more completely to Christ through Christ's suffering on the cross. And so it does have a, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why there is a closeness with Lent. Lent is that season that does bring us to read more of the monastic fathers and to consider their writings and their example and their guidance, because they are the ones who have most fully embraced suffering and seen its potential in attaining Christian perfection. So some books. So this book here, published by Cistercian Publications in Kalamazoo, Michigan, is The Lives of Simeon the Stylite. And it's an interesting text because it gives us the life story. However, you don't have to buy this book. You could actually find some of these lives already online. So if you Google it, not the whole book, but some of the lives are available. Then looking at the Ladder of Divine Ascent, the book on the monastic life by St. John of the Ladder, St. John Climacus. So there is a book written by Father John Mack, Ascending the Heights. And this is a very good book. It is a guide to the Ladder of Divine Ascent. Believe me, this does help, because reading the Ladder of Divine Ascent alone is very dense, because it does come from monasticism, from a monastic setting, And so some of the words are difficult to not only assimilate, but even understand at times. And so his guide helps very much in rendering and opening up. It opens up this treasure of the church and opens it up and makes it accessible to each one of us. So that's one. Then here's a book by Mike Aquilina. He is one of the Catholic scholars regarding the fathers of the church. You can actually even find him on YouTube speaking about the fathers. So this is the way of the fathers, praying with the early Christians. And so this is a very nice way of looking at the sayings and writings of different fathers on specific topics. And it's nice because it gives some guidance on topics such as community, culture, pleasure, the world, marriage and family, silence, doctrine, wisdom and truth. And there are a lot of different topics, and it's you could say it's timeless. The way that the fathers speak and write, they really do offer guidance that is still giving life and bringing life. Then here's another book called Earthen Vessels, The Practice of Personal Prayer, according to the patristic tradition. And it is by Father Gabriel Bunge, Bunge. And he was a Benedictine, but now he is an Orthodox monk. And however, you can see that this was written when he was still a Benedictine. His understanding of the prayer life of monastics is really remarkable, and especially the early monastics. And he makes it in his book, he renders it approachable and something that it's not about just studying what the monks did, but taking something out of it and integrating it so that this can enrich our prayer experience. And so this is another excellent book. And then, since we are looking also at some of the early fathers and mothers, there is a book by it's from different desert fathers and mothers from Paraclete Press. And it's called The Wisdom of the Desert Fathers and Mothers. And it is, the good thing is that it is in contemporary spoken English, because sometimes you can pick up these books of monastic sayings and you need a translation from the English to other English. And so this is rendered very understandable. And in this book, there is also the life of Anthony of Egypt, written by Saint Athanasius. It's contained in here, as well as then various sayings and teachings of the desert monastics, both men and women. So that's a little bit of, I think that very useful bibliography. And if you need any clarification on this, just let me know and I'll share with you specific information. Okay, questions? I think one of the beautiful realities that we've begun to appreciate again after Vatican II is this interconnectedness between monastics and laity. And so many monasteries in the West have developed like oblate programs. And so there are people who can become In a sense, they become attached to a monastery for spiritual guidance, and they go there to assist the monastics. And it's mutually beneficial. And and I think that is really consistent with the mindset of these early monasteries, was that the monastery and the community around the monastery would be integrated into each other, so that there isn't a separation, that the understanding is, we're all on this journey together, and the monastery is that place where there is a greater intensity and a greater focus on living the Christian life to the most, to its fullest and its most challenging extent. And that's something that is good and necessary for us as laity, diocesan clergy, because even as clergy, I'm not a monastic. Monastery, I always used to say, monastery is a nice place to visit, but I wouldn't want to live there. It's not for everyone, but to go to the monastery to recharge, to get spiritual direction, to pray with the community, those are things which have great spiritual benefits for us. So it's not an us and them, it's all of us together. But I think with Simeon, so the expression of suffering, the acceptance of suffering, is the recognition that we all suffer. Through our lives, there isn't a person who is not affected by suffering, physical, emotional. It's just a part of our reality. And so his example of amplifying that suffering by putting himself into a circumstance, on a column instead of in a hut with a roof, that's difficult for us to understand. But he's putting himself in the most extreme circumstance so that he would be able to completely overcome the physical experience of that suffering, that pain. It is one of the most, I would say, challenging examples of the concept of mind over matter. And and with monastics, that's one of the wonderful things, looking at monasteries and monastic saints. There's really something for everyone. So different saints have lived out their call in different ways, and they have all attained that level of perfection through different exercises, some being more dramatic than others, but that's the wonder, of being Christian, and looking at this cloud of witnesses, and and recognizing that some of them bear an affinity to our struggles and sufferings, that we can identify with them. I look at Saint Simeon sometimes, and I chuckle about the way that he avoided people. He had people who were following him around, affirming him, and it's like, and so, there are times when people aggravate me too. So it's like, I can, pray to Saint Simeon, grant me a column of my own, or something. I don't know. I do want to mention, we do actually have Saint Simeon on his column with buckets, I think, bread and water. There he is. when we talk about the process of hesychasm, the silence, that journey, that catharsis is the emptying. So we have an image or a practice that is commonly used that comes from the monasteries of Egypt. And it is a practice that is referred to as the Jesus prayer. And it is the repetition of the words, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Now, that is the entirety of the prayer. It can also be shortened and sometimes prayed, just Lord Jesus Christ, repeating the name of Jesus, or have mercy on me, or, so you can, and it's the repetition as you begin. It is a meditative prayer. And so as you begin the repetition and the words become more heard within yourself, slowly other sounds and noises will begin to fade out. But it takes time. It's something that you have to do slowly. And again, focusing on the words so that those other sounds and noises and even thoughts become less dominant, in where you're at that time. And so catharsis is the same thing. It is through practice of virtues, of prayer, of fasting, through all these different ways of connecting deeper with that spiritual base and foundation. It is, you could say it's plugging into divinity. It is, and when you do that, the intention is that all of the other stuff slowly be removed, that it slowly becomes less of a factor. Now with monasticism, so the key is they're going through this battle on a daily basis. There are a lot of things. Each one of us knows how difficult it is to multitask. We live in a world where multitasking is the greatest virtue. If you can, the more things you can do, the better you are, but the reality is that it's not all it's cracked up to be. And yet we're very often, we do still multitask. We may be driving and we're thinking about, formulating our shopping list, or, there's other things that are running at the same time. And, and of course there's a barrage of sounds and people who are talking at us. And then there's all the background noise, and so there's a lot going on. And so catharsis is getting rid of this so that we can hone in, focus more on God. And that is this is not it's not something that we can have a little bit of a taste of it, perhaps, by doing like a daily meditation, doing Jesus prayer, and putting aside that time to kind of empty ourselves of a lot of these things and just listen to the words, listen to the music, or whatever it is that's going to focus us. But the reality is, it's just, we get a little taste of it and then it's back to the grind and back to reality. The monastics present to us an example for our life. Now, I do think it's very interesting. Of course, that's just contributing to more noise, but there are some very interesting shows on TV about people who are like downsizing, and wanting to live off the grid. and and going to live in Alaska or something like that. And I find it fascinating because a lot of that resonates with that monastic desire of simplifying one's life and realizing what is important, what we need to focus on, and letting go of those other things that we we hang on to, things that sometimes hang on to us and affect our relationship with God, affect our ability to be fully Christian in virtue, action, word, deed, and yet we're struggling. And so that's catharsis, is that it is emptying, cleaning, simplifying, letting go, so that God can fill that in. No, not inside, because the columns were typically solid stone. However, there are, there probably still are, monastics who live like in caves. And so natural formations. There was a monk who lived in a tree, like not on a tree, but in a tree that had like an opening in it. So monastics could live in most places. What you mentioned from the gospel, so that's specific to prayer. So that's not about community life. Where two or three are gathered, Jesus is referencing the Jewish concept of minyan. Jewish communities cannot pray unless they have a certain number of men together, and then they can pray. And so when Jesus mentions the two or three, he is dramatically making a reduction in the required amount. Now that does affect us because, for example, in the Byzantine churches and in most of the Eastern churches, if there is liturgy and it is only the priest cannot celebrate alone. And that's because of Jesus's words. You got to have two. So in the Latin church, so they permitted private masses. And so you would have them, and that was done out of, I think, some also practical considerations. But as far as the Eastern approach to prayer, it is a community prayer. It can't be just one. And I'm talking liturgical prayer. Of course, you can pray alone because Jesus says to, go to your room, lock the door and pray. So you can't pray alone that way. When it comes though to monasticism was specifically founded based on an individual search for God and dying to those relationships, so that a man or a woman who went into a monastery would leave their mother and father, their siblings, and not see them again. The intention was to that they would, of course, pray for their loved ones, but they would be on their own. The church has recognized in these different monastics also not necessarily a community, but they have recognized leadership. So you would not have, like Simeon, by the time he was on the column, he was already recognized as being a spiritual father, being an elder. And so he was someone who people would come to. But that's only because in his youth, he had been led by a spiritual father. So that is the connectedness. It's not a call to community. Community is one of the aspects of monasticism, but hermit is another aspect of monasticism. Again, a hermit, even though he or she may live alone and isolated from all other monastics and all men and women, that hermit still has the spiritual guidance of a spiritual father or mother, someone who has specific gifts to guide that person on their journey. So there is an interconnectedness, but it's not necessarily the community life. Community life is just an aspect that is good for some, but not good for all. Well, and that's, the practices of Lent are not meant to be simply isolated to Lent, but rather they should bear fruits so that the journey down the road is now different. So that when we get out of Lent and into Easter, we can say, oh, I'm in a better place. I have clarity. I want to continue this. I want to, I've grown in some way. So it's like with each Lent, technically we should get better. So it should not just be, a repeat, not just reruns. And the early monastics also, if they did not have in their community or in their village, in their lavra, if they did not have the presence of a priest, so they would go then to one of the villages, and they would go there for liturgy to pray with the community. So there was an essential connection always with the sacramental and liturgical life of the church. So it wasn't. That's why with the heresy of Massalianism, that was a big issue, because it was basically this community saying, we don't need priests, we don't need bishops, we can do without them, and that's not the way of integration between monasticism and the life of the church, the worship of the church. Oh yeah, because this is one thing that I think Saint Anthony of Egypt did not necessarily want to organize or structure some monastic life. I mean, he didn't make a monastery; he made kind of a monastic village of hermits. But it was necessary because people were following him. And, and if they want to live that life, then just as he followed someone else and learned and experienced the, monastic life through the guidance of others, then in a sense, he has that responsibility to also guide the next generation, so it's interesting because it's a very different approach to, monastic life than what we see happening today, of young people when they go and want to become a monk or a nun. It's not quite going into the desert anymore, and you have to do all different kinds of psychological testing, and there's like it's a little different. Oh It's remarkable. Even think about how this, it's a year since the pandemic began. And think about how many monastic experiences we've been called to, we've been given by God, avoiding people and staying at home, and so we're living in some ways some of that monasticism, and I think personally looking at it that way is actually even helpful in dealing with some of the angst and stress of the whole situation. So monasticism is much more relevant. Well, and even think about the concept of catharsis. I mean, how I'm sure many of you, like myself, have realized how many things we regularly do and engage in and even enjoy are completely superfluous and unnecessary. And it's like, wow, I've been wasting my time for a long time enjoying that, and I'm living just fine not doing that. So it's so there is that aspect of it too. That is the correct attitude. Remember Jesus's talk parable about the Pharisee and the publican. It's like we need all of these fathers, all of these saints. They have cultivated that humility before God, and I think that is the correct and proper attitude. When we come before God and ask God to assist us, perfect us, fill us, so that we would be perfect, for Him. That's the journey. And yes, some of the saints are daunting, and intimidating, but that is their journey, and we have to take from it inspiration and know that they intercede for us. They pray for us. They pray with us. And so it's not, don't be intimidated by them, or, don't look at their example for what it is. It is an example. It is, something that we can learn. We don't have to imitate it in its fullness. It's not a challenge. It's not a race, that now we have to outdo him. No, it's about being able to look for a model, a support, an inspiration on the journey. So it's all good. Okay. Have a good evening. You're welcome. Good night.
Blessed is the kingdom of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy